China. Talk about China, and I like to think of them as the people who almost did. Who almost did, but they didn't. They almost did what? Almost overspread the whole globe with their culture and their language. I mean, these, up until the year 1500, these were the most inventive, most creative, possibly the most united. Most united, most inventive, most creative people on the face of the globe. But they fell short. And ultimately, it was not the united Chinese, it was the disunited Europeans. We're going to spend some time talking about where did China go wrong? What did China do that was wrong? Anyway, in chapter 5, we spent a couple pages talking about China under the Han. And again, your authors are setting you up for what you call comparative world history. And yeah, folks, I'm in favor of teaching comparative history. Because in the case of China and India and Europe, even to a lesser extent the Islamic world, but China and India and Europe all went through a bright age about the time of Christ, where they were all strong and powerful. Then came a dark age that lasted in China for only 400 years, in Europe for about 700 or 800 years, and in India, it's hard to tell when it ended, but it ended with outsiders conquering them. The dark age, or the period of chaos, folk, again, you all know my theory, I hope, was brought on by a climate change, namely global cooling. The global cooling is known to have probably affected the whole northern hemisphere, and maybe even affected the North American Indians. Even though the Indians did not keep written records, it's more difficult to tell. So we have to figure when studying the American Indian, we figure from archaeology. And a big question I have is, what was the southern part of the world like? And again, we know so little about the southern part of humanity that we can't really comment on it intelligently. But for the northern part of humanity, which is where most humanity lives, in the north of the equator, they went through a period of dark. In the case of China, they had a period of chaos. But India and China both had a period of chaos. Your book says India finally united in the 1500s, thanks in large part to being conquered by foreigners. China achieved stability in the 600s. And China became more and more stable and bigger. By the time Marco Polo arrived, Marco Polo was an Italian who went all the way to China and became high up in the court of Kublai Khan. China was at that time probably the richest nation on earth. Now, folk we here who are Americans don't look back to a past and say, ooh, I wish things were as good as they were back then. We think we're living in the best time for American history, even though some believe that the present generation is declining. And maybe America is declining, but the Chinese, all right, well, let me start with the Romans. The Romans look back to a time, hey, at one time we had the whole Mediterranean world and we were the boss. Mussolini, as recently as 1940s and 1930s, tried to rebuild the Roman Empire. He failed. The Greeks, they recall the days of Socrates, the days of Alexander the Great. Macedonia especially recalls the days of Alexander the Great. We once conquered most of the known world. They'd like to rebuild that, but they have not been able to. China looked back to their history and said, one time we had a glorious history, we were united, we had strong kings, what happened to us? They looked back to the past, which again is something we Americans don't tend to do. The Chinese began to believe in a cyclical view of history. That history was driven by the forces of the yang and yin, in other words, the sun and moon, the good and evil, positive and negative, north and south, and there was the opposites. You had opposite forces opposing each other, but as these forces intertwined, they created the world as we know of today. A new China, though it emerged in the 700s, your book says, bore little resemblance to the old China. They had looked back to the glorious past under the Han, trying to rebuild it, but the new China just simply did not bear much resemblance to that old China. Alright, when the Han Dynasty fell, and again, Europe had the same problem, folks. In chapter 12, we'll go back to Europe, but I've already hinted about this in Europe. Barbarian people came in Europe, that is. We call them the Goths, the Visigoths, the Ostrogoths, the Vandals, the Franks, oh yeah, the Saxons.